Hey everyone, I wanted to offer an educational segment today. I was reading a new book that somebody gave me called Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. And it was written by a friend of mine, William J. Federer, for those of you that know him. Basically, the book begins with the idea that socialism will solve the world's problems, that there'll be free healthcare, free education, free food, free housing, free public transportation, free childcare, guaranteed jobs, paid vacations, free welfare for the poor. Doesn't that sound like today? The one thing I've said over and over again is for those that don't know the mistakes of history, we're doomed to repeat them. Just in that statement alone, it would be clear that America is not just not just marching lightly or treading lightly, it's marching full speed ahead. So a few things that I had gotten out of this are some bullet points I wanted to highlight with you. For those of you that don't have time to read, I thought that I would share some of these bullet points to give you kind of a summary so you have a basic understanding of what the beginning of this book is about and how you can relate it to history so you'll know more about socialism in case it's been a while since you've read anything about it. Plato was actually the first one to suggest it, and there's actually a word utopia that actually came from Sir Thomas More's 16th century book called The New Island of Utopia. So that's kind of a new little tidbit that I didn't know. We can also look at, and we can also question whether the problem is actually between capitalism and socialism, which the leftists like to argue, or is the real problem the selfishness in the human heart? Most of us that are Christians would understand that, but I think most of us that have been marginalized as Christians have seemed to have forgotten that. How are crises, whether planned or coincidental, used to implement socialism? That's something we're clearly seeing today. And is it possible to be a Christian and a socialist? And just because something needs to be done, is it always the government's job to do it? Now, when I visit with government entities, I would commonly suggest that there's more than one way to be able to retrieve the money they need. One of them is through taxation, which people don't like, and the other one is to try to find volunteer mechanisms to be able to gain the money and support that is needed. Also, that has a slippery slope as well, and one of those examples, obviously, is the amount of support that we get for public education by places like Chevron, which is a globalist organization, and, for example, Catherine Albertson or the Albertsons Foundation, which has arguably helped destroy or brainwash the minds of our youth here in Idaho. Also, I didn't know this too, but Atlantis, I guess, was a fictitious creation of Plato, which is kind of cool. Basically, that he had stated that in this wonderful city that they were obedient to laws, and the only thing that mattered to them was virtue. Everything else was despised. And the idea, according to Plato, was that Atlantis fell out of the favor of the Greek gods and then was submerged into the sea. He believed in a structured society. First, there would be democracy, demos meaning people, and cracy meaning to rule. And Plato had written that every man does what is right in his own eyes and has his own way of life. Well, when you understand democracy, you understand that it's majority rule. Eventually, in the book and inherently in the de-evolution of society, what you find out is democracy ends up leading to despotism. So that's really something to think about. When everybody's off doing their own thing, then all of a sudden they become lawless, and then what? So when a government earnestly undertakes to root out terrorism, public opinion immediately accuses it of violating the terrorists' civil rights. I think that was really interesting because we start seeing that a lot today, right? People that are radical, people committing murders and heinous crimes are somehow, given leniency in prison. His fourth note was democracy loves tolerance. Everything in a democracy is tolerated, and that obviously allows everybody to believe and think the way they want, and then all of a sudden lawlessness ensues. Such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government distributing equality to equals and unequals alike. Plato warned that freedom unrestrained by private moral virtue would eventually lead to licentiousness and sexual promiscuity. And then he got into the company of a licentious sort of people, and taking to all of their wanton ways, rushed into the opposite extreme. And that was when Plato was describing the attitude of the youth. And Aristotle, that was a student of Plato, basically said this quote that I happen to remember, which is one of the few that I remember, and that is that tolerance is the last virtue of a dying society. Samuel Johnson, the renowned British compiler of the Dictionary on the English Language in 1755, wrote that with sensual gratifications we entangle ourselves in business and immerse ourselves in luxury. And point number 5, democracy to disillusion, is that by degrees the anarchy finds a way into private homes. The son is on the level with his father, he having no respect or reverence for either of his parents, and this is his freedom. Citizens then yield to the selfish human inclinations, avarice, and vote to spread the city's wealth around, draining the treasury. Harry Truman said in 1951, selfishness and greed can tear a nation apart. When they run out of money, Plato explains they vote to take the money from the rich. Now, when they say vote, this is important to recognize that it's the people. It's you and I. It's not the politicians, it's the people. We're always blaming everybody else for the problems, and I'm trying to tell everybody that it's not them, it's us, because, anyway. The leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them among the people, at the same time taking care of the reserve, the larger part for themselves, which is the oligarchs. Point number 6 is promiscuity and decadence. In J.D. Unwin published a book called Sex and Culture, and this is really interesting. After studying 86 different tribes and civilizations over 5,000 years, including the Sumerians, Babylonians, Greeks, Romans, Teutons, the Anglo-Saxons, Unwin found that sexual promiscuity always preceded the decline of a civilization. Something to consider about that for those that aren't Christians, that claim to be libertarians, that don't necessarily believe that there is a God. Some do, but some don't. It is critically important to understand the importance of virtue and how it's defined. In contrast to his research also showed 100% correlation between monogamous heterosexual marriage and cultural advancement. Unwin concluded that cultures go through 4 stages: pain, productive, prosperous, and promiscuous. At the time, people go through a painful time of struggle, famine, or war. They then exhibit self-discipline and become productive, protective, innovative, pioneering, and expansionistic. Eventually, they become prosperous and enjoy their abundance. They soon become lax, cast off discipline, lose courage, and self-restraint. They indulge in self-gratification, decadence, and the pursuit of pleasure and sexual promiscuity. The culture weakens and degenerates into lawlessness and insecurity. And Solzhenitsyn said, when the modern Western states were being formed, it was proclaimed that man lives in order to be free and pursue happiness. What does man live for today? Destructive and irresponsible freedom has turned out to have a scarce defense against the abyss of human decadence. In item number 7, loss of morals and courage, I found this rather interesting. Domestic insecurity and upheaval signals weakness to surrounding nations. Unrestrained immigration followed by outright invasion. So if history is accurate, and what we're looking at is understanding the mistakes of history to see where we are as a country, we can understand that now that we've allowed this unrestrained immigration, we can only look forward to outright invasion. And are we ready for this? When a society is consumed with selfishness, citizens lack the self-sacrificing willingness to defend it. The decline in courage may be the most striking feature that is an outside observer notices in the West today. Self-serving rationales and the decline of courage at times attaining would be termed the lack of manhood. They get paralyzed when they deal with threatening forces, with aggressors and international terrorists. One must point out that the ancient times that from ancient times a decline in courage has been considered the first symptom of the end. Now, in some of these videos that I've talked about, I don't know that I've actually come out and said lack of courage. My statements are more like, what the hell is everybody doing, and where the hell is everybody? A great example of that was a painful time of Egyptian bondage and 40 years of wandering the desert. Then Solomon became sexually promiscuous with 1,000 wives, and immediately after his death, Israel was weakened by internal division, weakness to surrounding nations, and then attacks by the Egyptians, Philistines, Arabians, Ethiopians, Assyrians, Syrians, and eventually the remaining inhabitants of Judah were carried away into Babylon. Unwin noticed that once a nation begins to go down the path of self-indulgence and promiscuity, it never recovers. John Adams asked Jefferson in 1818, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty. So without virtue, what are we actually fighting for? General Douglas MacArthur in 1951 said, history fails to record a single precedent in which nations subject to moral decay have not passed into political and economic decline. Number 8. This is an interesting thing and something definitely to consider. Number 8 is called Who Can Fix This Mess? Plato described how once citizens give up virtue, yield to passion, and become financially irresponsible, the resulting chaos, anarchy, and insecurity causes them to look for someone to come along and fix the mess. Once we reach this level of debasement, the people, you and I, look for someone to come along and fix the mess, like the leftists did with Obama, like the conservatives did with Trump. Insatiable desires and neglect introduces the change in democracy, which occasions a demand for tyranny. The Democrats contemptuously rejected temperance. Citizens chaff impatiently. They cease to care even for laws written and unwritten. And this is the fair and glorious beginning out of which springs dictatorship. The excessive increase of anything causes a reaction in the opposite direction, and so dictatorship naturally arises out of democracy. Now, something to consider here is your government for many, many years has told you that we're a democracy. What did I just tell you? The excessive increase of anything causes the reaction in the opposite direction, and so a dictatorship naturally arises out of democracy. Your governments are playing you. They're telling you openly that you are a democracy so that you can already be willing to accept a tyrant dictator. If we knew our history, we would know that, and we would be able to understand the language that they use. Representative Fisher Ames said democracy could not last. When the tyranny of the majority leads to chaos, society will submit to the rule of the sword. And the British statesman Edmund Burke in 1791 said, what is liberty without virtue? It is the greatest of all possible evils, madness without restraint. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon them, upon will and appetite be placed somewhere. Is that going to be placed upon ourselves, or is that going to be placed upon the government to control us? Montesquieu, once the citizens abandon virtue, a republic will become lawless, causing individuals to seek someone that can restore order. Popular government will then be usurped by a despotic mayor or governor who will control his subjects through the desire for reward or the fear of punishment. Montesquieu also wrote, when virtue is banished, ambition invades the minds of those who are disposed to receive it, and avarice, greed, possesses the whole community. James Monroe in 1817 said, it's only when people become ignorant and corrupt, when they degenerate into a populist mob, that are incapable of exercising their sovereignty. Usurpation is then easily attained. The people themselves become the willing instruments of their own debasement and ruin. The people themselves, not the people that we're pointing fingers at, the people we should be pointing our fingers at, which is you and I. We all know that we were given a republic if we can keep it. And keeping it didn't mean pointing the finger at everybody else. It needed to make sure that we were pointing the fingers at ourselves and perhaps each other, only in the fashion of iron sharpening iron. Without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and license. Unless men exercise their freedom in a just and honest way within moral restraints, a free society can degenerate into anarchy. Plato predicted that democracy is destined to devolve into anarchy, out of which a tyrant would arise. Talking point number 9, people cry for a protector. At first, the mayor or the governor would appear as the protector, promising to restore order, but soon they consolidate power and rules as a tyrant. Full of smiles, making promises, liberating debtors, distributing land, wanting to be so kind. This is the root from where tyrant springs. Hinting at the abolition of debts and the partition of lands, he begins to make a party against the rich. Payment of taxes, and thus compelled to devote themselves to their daily wants and therefore less likely to conspire against them. Plato explained that the protector uses his newly acquired power to target his political opponents. January 6th. And the protector of the people, having a mob entirely at his disposal, he is not restrained from shedding the blood of his kinsmen by the favorite method of false accusations that he brings into court and murders them. Plato continued, how then does a protector begin to change into a tyrant? He begins to grow unpopular. The protector is the overthrow of many, standing up in the chariot of the state with the rein in his hand, and no longer the protector, but tyrant absolute. Aristotle stated, a man rules in his own interest and becomes a tyrant. A tyrant takes money away from his political opponents and funnels it and benefits his political supporters, Brad Little. And finally, number 10, the rise of a tyrant. The spirit of faction in times of great excitement imposes itself upon the people as a genuine spirit of freedom and, like false Christs, it is like a one-way ratcheting wrench where each click the ratchet tightens and there's no going back. A rare leader may stall this trend, but like gravity, the next ratchets again. Trump to Biden, right? Pompey wanted to preserve the Roman Republic, but he was followed by Julius Caesar, who slyly claimed to support the poor against the rich, only to usurp power and make himself emperor. Senator Daniel Webster in 1834 said a contest for ages has been to rescue liberty from the grasp of executive power. And Truman said, when we forget the examples of such men as Washington, Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson, all of whom could have had a continuation in the office, then we will start down the road to a dictatorship and ruin. And finally, Ben Franklin warned in 1787, there is a scarce king in 100 who would not, if he could, follow the example of Pharaoh. Get first all of the people's money, then all of their lands, and then make them and their children servants forever. Did you ever read of any punishment of those in power inflicted by those that had no power? Can the annals of mankind exhibit one single example where rulers overcharged with power willingly let go? And finally, Prime Minister William Pitt stated in November 18th of 1783, necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. COVID masks and mandates and vaccines and the long litany of other things that we've experienced locally. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing tyranny today. We're experiencing the rise of a despot. We're experiencing the rise of a totalitarian government that is supported by we the people because we don't know history. And I hope just from the 10 talking points that I gave you would give you enough of an understanding, at least according to Plato, exactly where we are and where we're going. Thanks for watching, guys. See you later.